Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for November 14th, 2025. It's Friday, so I'm going to take your questions, and the questions will include an update on what's going on in Ukraine, the U.S. economy, the upcoming meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and a brief update on Jeffrey Epstein. So starting with the first question, this is what a viewer wrote in. With Ukraine's military being decimated and Western Europe's governments facing severe budgetary constraints to a military buildup, and the latest reports of official corruption in Ukraine, where are the sane leaders in Europe? Well, the answer is that's a really good question. The London Times just did an interview with Ukraine's deputy foreign minister, and he admitted that Kiev has halted the participation in peace talks with Russia. And he said the reason is there can be no progress with Putin. Now, of course, the Russian spokesmen have a disagreement with that. They say that the Zelensky regime has no desire for peace. And they point out that Ukraine has violated the agreements that were already made on prisoner exchange. Maria Zakharova, the spokesman for the foreign ministry, said that Ukraine has broken its promises. Fewer than 30% of the 1,200 prisoners agreed upon have been exchanged. And she said, quote, Ukraine's citizens should be told about this, should be told the truth, unquote. Now, in the meantime, you have a series of provocations. The Russians exposed a plan, a false flag plan by Ukraine to have a Russian jet attack the U.S. military base in Romania, and then blaming Russia. This, of course, could have led immediately to a nuclear war. Meanwhile, the ongoing NATO exercises that are concentrating on turning the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, that is blocking access to the Baltic, to the Russian fleet. Especially Sweden and Estonia are involved in this, but it's NATO, the NATO military exercises as a whole. And as part of these, a U.S. bomber flew to within 50 miles of the Russian border. This is the kind of provocative actions that could lead to war. And it's also the problem for Europe that there's no agreement on what to do with the $300 or so billion of Russian funds that have been seized and are being held in Western banks. A lot of that money is in Belgian banks, and the Prime Minister of Belgium refused to allow it to be sent out on his watch. So with that on hold, Ursula von der Leyen, the would-be warrior of the European Commission, has called for the European countries to take out large loans to cover the military costs. Now, is that a very good idea when you have an economic collapse in many countries in Europe? Macron is in trouble, Starmer's in trouble, Merz continues to decline in popularity. So the European side of this is a commitment to war, but for what purpose? Do they really believe that Vladimir Putin is preparing an invasion of Western Europe? It's almost impossible to imagine what the discussions are like in the war rooms of these countries. Now, then you have on top of that the latest revelations of corruption at the highest levels in Ukraine's government, including the energy minister, the justice minister, and Zelensky's former business partner. Corruption in Ukraine is not new, but it's not under control. Can you imagine going to the voters in Germany saying, we're going to give another $100 billion to Ukraine and watch it go into the hands of the kleptocrats running that country? So the whole strategy is insane, and the questioner is right. It's time for sane leaders in the West to step forward, and they need to have a foot in their rear end to get them to do that. Now, the one thing on the corruption scandal, by the way, is that it may be that Soros networks are partly involved in it, trying to get someone other than Zelensky. But we'll see. We'll have more on this in the days ahead. Now, if we're going to look into corruption, we should also look at the British and German military contractors who are profiting from this wartime buildup while the economies of those countries are in trouble. Now, next we have a question. Any news on the follow-up to the August Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit? Well, there was just a 3-day summit, video summit, that drafted plans for expanded multilateral trade and economic cooperation. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization heads of state will be meeting next week in Moscow. Keep in mind that the Shanghai Cooperation countries represent over 40% of the human race, and their GDP growth has been astonishing. So the continued efforts by these countries for cooperation for mutual benefit are putting them at the forefront of international economic policy. How will the West respond? Well, hopefully saner heads will prevail. Now, also on the development front, the foreign ministers of Egypt and Turkey just met, and they had an agreement to have a reconstruction plan for Gaza, which they'll take up at a conference in Cairo shortly. The starting point for that should be LaRouche's Oasis Plan. Now, what about the U.S. economy? Well, there are continued warnings about a tech bubble, and within the tech bubble, the artificial intelligence bubble, that these are clearly bubbles, and bubbles always pop, but people are still making money from them, so they're continuing to pour money in, making the bubbles bigger. Now, there are new warnings that have come on the developing home foreclosure crisis. There were nearly 37,000 foreclosures posted in October. That's up almost 20% over October last year. There are warnings that these are echoes of what happened before the 2007-2008 mortgage-backed security bubble popped. And that cost taxpayers between $20 and $27 trillion to bail out the banks and financial institutions, insurance companies, and so on. We're headed in that direction again. Only, as Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan said, it's now 10 times larger. And he used the figure 14 trillion from 2007-2008, which I think is an understatement. But he said he's expecting a $140 trillion explosion in the bond markets. So this is where things stand in terms of the U.S. They're attributing the foreclosure crisis to high borrowing costs, as interest rates are still high, to the soaring insurance rates, and also a decline in available savings. So meanwhile, the budget deficit continues to climb, continues to take more money from the next year's budget. And what are they doing in the Congress? They're debating whether we should go to war with Venezuela. Now, let's turn to Jeffrey Epstein. And I guess we have to do it, as unsavory as it is. There's been some new stories coming out on this never-ending saga. And the drip, drip, drip of the last 6 years is accelerating. It's now at the point where Republicans in Congress are joining Democrats in calling for a release of the Epstein files. Now, this is going to be quite interesting because there are new emails coming out which show Epstein's close relationship with Israeli spies, with U.S. tech firms, including Palantir's Peter Thiel, and with British arms trafficking. This is very much the subject of an article that I'm writing for the Executive Intelligence Review on who is Jeffrey Epstein really. The first part is in this week's issue, and hopefully I'll be able to finish the second part for this next week's issue. And it's going to take a look at not the sex trafficking, which of course shows what kind of immoral person Epstein was, which is why he was so valuable to the establishment. But it shows his connection to spies, to surveillance technology, to military and arms trafficking, and to organized crime networks in the United States. It's the story you're not getting in the media. Now, we'll have a special offer for an Executive Intelligence Review online subscription in the description section. But if someone wants to get a copy of this week's report that I wrote, which is in this week's Executive Intelligence Review, send me an email with your email address and I'll send it out to you. My email, as most of you know, is harleysch@gmail.com. The reason this is an important story is that it shows the depth of the corruption of the entire political and financial elite establishment in the United States. And if we're going to make a change, you need to know who's doing these things and why. That's what I'm trying to do in these two-part series. So jump on it, take advantage of this offer, and subscribe to the Executive Intelligence Review, which is the intelligence magazine that intelligence professionals are turning to. Now, one final note. Later this morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll have this week's Zoom call of the International Peace Coalition. There have been some new developments, including some open support from leading members of the Israeli peace movement for the LaRouche Oasis plan. So be sure to tune into that and be a part of the discussion. So thanks for joining us this week. Use this weekend well. Look for demonstrations, look for opportunities to talk to people, and we'll see you again on Monday.